It's June 1348. The people of Malcolm Regis, now Weymouth, watched from the harbour as a merchant vessel limped toward their shores. The ship's sails were torn, its deck eerily quiet. Something was clearly wrong. As the gangplank lowered, the survivors who stumbled off weren't celebrating their safe arrival. They were dying. Black boils the size of apples bulged from their necks and armpits. Blood poured from their mouths. And in their wake, they brought something that would kill 1/3 of England's population. This is the story of the plague ship that changed Britain forever. To understand this ship's deadly cargo, we need to go back to where it all began. The year is 1347, and death is stalking Europe. They called it the Great Mortality, what we now know as the Black Death. It had already devastated the eastern Mediterranean, swept through Italy, and was clawing its way across France. City after city fell silent. In some places, there weren't enough living left to bury the dead. The disease was unlike anything medieval physicians had ever seen. Victims developed fever, chills, and vomiting. Then came the buboes, swollen lymph nodes that turned black and burst. Most died within days, some within hours. But how did this nightmare reach England? The answer lies in the lifeblood of medieval Europe: trade. English merchants had been trading with Gascony, a region in southwestern France controlled by England, for decades. Wine, wool, and spices flowed between the ports. But in 1348, these same trade routes became highways of death. Our story begins in a Gascon port, likely Bordeaux. A merchant vessel loads its cargo: barrels of wine, bales of cloth, and something else. Something invisible, deadly, and unstoppable. Hidden in the ship's hold, black rats carried fleas, and those fleas carried Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague. Every bite from an infected flea was a death sentence waiting to happen. The journey from Gascony to England typically took just a few days, but for the crew of this particular vessel, it became a floating tomb. Imagine the horror. One by one, crew members began falling ill. First, a sailor complains of fever. By the next day, he's covered in black boils. By the third day, he's dead. The disease spreads through the cramped quarters like wildfire. The ship's master faced an impossible choice: turn back to a port that might refuse them entry, or press on to England, hoping to find help. He chose to continue. But by the time the English coast came into view, most of the crew was dead or dying. The ship that had left Gascony with perhaps 20 men aboard now carried mostly corpses. Malcolm Regis was a prosperous port town. Merchants, fishermen, and dock workers went about their daily business, unaware that death was approaching their shores. When the plague ship arrived, the townspeople initially rushed to help. This was their fatal mistake. In trying to save the few survivors, they sealed their own doom. The Grey Friars Chronicle recorded the moment. In this year, 1348, in Melcombe in the county of Dorset, a little before the feast of St. John the Baptist, 2 ships, one of them from Bristol, came alongside the quay. But what the Chronicle doesn't capture is the human drama. Picture John the dock worker helping unload cargo, unknowingly handling plague-infected goods, or Mary the tavern keeper offering shelter to the sick sailors, not knowing she was inviting death into her establishment. The local physicians were baffled. They'd never seen anything like this. Some blamed poisoned air or unfavorable alignments of the planets. Others thought it was divine punishment for sin. None understood they were facing a bacterial infection spread by flea bites. Within days, the disease began its terrible work. The people who had helped the sailors started falling ill. Then their families, then their neighbours. Malcolm Regis became ground zero for the English apocalypse. From Malcolm Regis, the Black Death spread like spilled ink across parchment. It followed the roads, the rivers, and the trade routes that connected medieval England. Fleeing refugees carried the disease to nearby towns. Merchants unknowingly transported it in their goods. Even attempts to escape the plague only helped it spread faster. By autumn 1348, the plague had reached London. The capital, with its crowded streets and poor sanitation, became a death trap. The city's graveyards overflowed, new burial grounds had to be consecrated almost weekly. The chronicler Geoffrey the Baker wrote, "In most places, not even a fifth of the people were left alive. Entire villages were abandoned, fields lay unharvested. The social fabric of medieval England was unraveling. But perhaps most terrifying was the randomness of it all. The plague didn't discriminate. It killed peasants and nobles, young and old, priests and sinners. Death had become the great equalizer. The church, which should have provided comfort, was devastated. So many priests died that the remaining clergy couldn't perform all the last rites. Some regions lost half their clergy. People died without spiritual comfort, which for medieval believers was almost as horrifying as death itself." Behind the staggering statistics lay countless personal tragedies. Families were torn apart overnight. Children were orphaned. Entire bloodlines ended. Consider the story of one family we'll call the Millers. William Miller was a successful cloth merchant in Dorset. When the plague arrived, he had a wife, 4 children, and a thriving business. Within 2 months, only his youngest daughter survived. This wasn't unusual. Entire families were wiped out so quickly that neighbors would find houses full of corpses days later. The living couldn't keep up with burying the dead. The economic impact was catastrophic. With so many workers dead, fields went unharvested, crafts went unmade, trade ground to a halt. The feudal system, which had dominated English society for centuries, began to crumble. But for the survivors, paradoxically, life sometimes improved. With fewer people competing for resources, wages rose. Peasants who had been bound to the land found new opportunities. The plague that had brought death also brought social change. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 might never have happened without the social disruption caused by the Black Death. The plague ship that arrived in 1348 didn't just bring disease, it brought revolution. By 1350, the worst of the plague had passed, but England was forever changed. The population had fallen from perhaps 4 million to fewer than 3 million. Entire regions lay depopulated. You can still see the scars today. Throughout England, there are lost villages, places where medieval communities once thrived but were abandoned during the plague years. Archaeological surveys have identified over 3,000 such sites. The plague also transformed English culture. Art became more focused on death and mortality. The famous memento mori tradition, "Remember you must die," became widespread. Churches filled with macabre imagery of skeletons and decay. Medicine too was revolutionized. The plague's devastation forced physicians to question traditional treatments. While they still didn't understand bacteria, they began to develop new approaches to public health and disease prevention. The English government passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. But the economic forces unleashed by the plague were too powerful to contain. The old order was dying along with the plague victims. Women gained new opportunities as widows inherited businesses and property. The rigid social hierarchy began to loosen. The seeds of the Renaissance were being planted in plague-ravaged soil. That unnamed merchant vessel that limped into Malcolm Regis in June 1348 carried more than just plague. It carried the future of England. Today, Weymouth, the modern name for Malcolm Regis, is a bustling seaside town. Few visitors know they're standing at the spot where medieval England died and modern England began. The chroniclers who recorded the plague's arrival couldn't have imagined its long-term impact. They saw only death and devastation. But that single ship's arrival set in motion changes that would reshape English society for centuries. The feudal system's collapse, the rise of individual rights, the transformation of medicine, the emergence of new economic systems, all can be traced back to that moment when death came ashore. Sometimes the course of history turns on the smallest things: a flea bite, a ship's cargo, a decision to help strangers in need. In 1348, a single vessel brought an end to the medieval world, and from its ashes, the modern world began. If you like this video, please consider subscribing. We aim to bring you videos about the hidden histories of Britain and the artifacts of Albion. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day.